Howdy everyone, it's Sam. Hope you're doing really well. If you're new around here, hope I can get you to consider liking the content, then subscribing to the channel. And if you are a regular around these here parts, thank you very much for the continuous support. Let's have a look at the Canterbury-Bankstown Bulldogs 2023 draw. And again, this is a team that is going to suffer from the FIFA Women's World Cup. They will have to change their home ground between July and late August. Let's get into the first section of their season right now. The Bulldogs 2023 campaign begins with back-to-back away games. Round number one is a trip up to Four Pines Park to take on the Manly Sea Eagles on a Saturday afternoon, Saturday 3 p.m. to be more specific. Tom Turbo may not be back for this game. Anthony Seibold is the new head coach. We're going to get a great glimpse into Cameron Ciraldo as well. Plus we get to see Kikau Amani. It's going to be a really good game. The Bulldogs took Manly to the limit last season in a similar time frame to last year. So this is going to be a really tough way an exciting way as well to see how the Bulldogs go in round number one. Round number two, they take on the Melbourne Storm down at Amy Park on a Saturday 7:30 fixture. Potentially Ryan Papenhuyzen could be back for this game, but that's going to be Storm's first home game for the year. And that is, while Manly didn't make the top 8 last year, that is a tough 2 weeks to start the season for anybody, in my opinion. In round number 3, they then have their first official home game for the year. They travel to Belmore Sports Ground and they host the West Tigers there on a Sunday afternoon Channel 9 game. If the atmosphere is anything like it was last year when they hosted the Dragons, that's going to be something very, very special to look forward to. I'm actually quite keen on that one. And that is actually the start of 3 straight Sunday afternoon games. Game number 2 is going to occur, obviously, in round number 4. They travel over the ditch to Mount Smart Stadium to take on the New Zealand Warriors. And me personally, I'm a little bit nostalgic for Warriors and Bulldogs games because I obviously grew up and really started remembering rugby league games and stories in the early 2000s. So from 2001 through till 2007, it felt like Warriors and Bulldogs was a fixture that a lot of people looked at and went, oh, I do want to see what happens that weekend. And then the final game of their Sunday trilogies is going to take place at Sydney Olympic Park, where they are the home side for the first time officially in 2023, and they host the North Queensland Cowboys that night. And that is going to be a litmus test big time for the North Queensland Cowboys, because it would be their first trip outside of the state of Queensland for 2023. And I'm sure the Bulldogs will want to stick it up us big time in that game. So to put in a nutshell, for section number 1 of 2023, they have 3 away games: Manly, Melbourne and New Zealand, that you could figure out, or you could formulate a much more tougher 3 away games, but that's pretty tough in and of itself. And then there are 2 home games against the North Queensland Cowboys, which is going to be tough because they were last year's preliminary finalists. And the West Tigers, we just don't know what we're going to get from them this year. They're just a completely different animal, or a different looking animal in 2023. So of all the clubs that I've looked at so far, I think that has a case to that could be the toughest start to the season of any of the clubs that I've looked at so far. Moving into section number 2 of 2023 for the Canterbury-Bankstown Bulldogs. Thankfully, the end of section number 1 is the start of 2 home games back to back, but it's an extremely short turnaround for the Doggies. So they play Sunday twilight against the Cowboys, and then they host the South Sydney Rabbitohs for the traditional annual Easter Good Friday clash. So that's a very short turnaround for the Doggies, and the strength of opposition as well is quite high. Then you shift over into round number 7, and they travel to CommBank Stadium for a Sunday afternoon game against the Parramatta Eels. So 3 weeks in a row, Cowboys, South Sydney and Parramatta. That's a really tough 3 weeks, which is then capped off with the Cronulla Sharks visiting the Bulldogs at Accor Stadium in round 8, Saturday 5:30 p.m. So those 4 weeks, those 4 teams are, oh man, they're really gonna test out the Bulldogs. And yeah, the Doggies fans, I shudder to think what they're going to feel like when the Cowboys come to town, and then they've got to experience that month of rugby league. That's a tough period for the Doggies, even though they don't leave the state of New South Wales at all. Then we shift over to round number 9, and the boys travel down to WIN Stadium in Wollongong for another Sunday game and another Channel 9 game, the Dragons versus the Bulldogs. And the Bulldogs have been quite the thorn in the side of the team from Cogra and Wollongong, even though that might be changing pretty soon just to Cogra. Section number 2 finishes with a trip to Suncorp Stadium, their first trip to Queensland for 2023, where they are technically the home side. They host the Canberra Raiders, the very first game of Magic Round. And the Bulldogs and Raiders, they can play some really close games, even though maybe the quality may not be very high. But Section 2 of 2023, they've got Rabbits, Eels, Sharks, Raiders and Dragons. Besides the Dragons, all 5 of those teams I just mentioned, 4 of those made the top 8 in 2022 and are heavy chances to make it again in 2023. And you throw in one more game where they've got to travel, and it's to Queensland for the first time in 2023. That's another tricky situation for the Bulldogs to try and comprehend. And while they were the technical home side for Magic Round, when they have hosted the Canberra Raiders, they are then back down for back-to-back home games down at Accor Stadium, and that's how their Section 3 of 2023 starts on a Friday night 6 p.m. game against the New Zealand Warriors. So they get the Warriors double out of the way very quickly this year. 1 week later, they have a bit of a long layoff, and then they play another Sunday game, but it's 2 p.m, still out at Sydney Olympic Park. The Gold Coast Titans travel down to take on the Canterbury-Bankstown Bulldogs. So the strength of opposition, while the Warriors and Titans are unpredictable in their own right, and will have some challenges and cause some headaches for the Bulldogs, just the strength of opposition does finally start to dip a little bit for them inside that fortnight period. And then finally in round number 13, they have their first bye, and that's a round where players who are going to be playing in Origin are going to be pulled out of club footy, but thankfully the Bulldogs won't feel any of those effects. And just off the top of my head, I don't think they're going to have any Origin representatives unless if Reid Marnie finds himself an avenue, or maybe if Matt Burton finds himself an avenue as well. So maybe they might not be Origin affected. Round 14 sees a much tougher challenge. They have their bye, and then they travel up to, what's the stadium called? Industry Group Stadium in Gosford. I'm just going to call it Central Coast Stadium for the rest of the year. They travel up to Gosford to take on the Sydney Roosters Sunday 2 p.m. They are dominating the Sunday fixtures, aren't they, the Bulldogs? And then they have a very special fixture, one that I'm glad that has been changed very recently. They play on that Sunday against the Roosters, and they have over a week off. They play on the Queen's birthday, or the King's birthday, sorry, on the Monday, the 12th of June, against the Parramatta Eels out there at Accor Stadium. And their record on the King's long weekend is great. It's a great record the Doggies have got on that public holiday. So Section 3, I don't even know if it's a word, but it's the most navigatable. I don't even know if that's a word. I'm going to look that up after this. That's the most navigatable section for the Bulldogs so far in 2023, in my opinion. Section 4 starts on Sunday afternoon again for a Channel 9 game. They travel to PointsBet Stadium to take on the Cronulla Sutherland Sharks. They then have a bye in round number 17, their second of 3. In round number 18, they then host the Newcastle Knights out there at Accor Stadium. Again, another Sunday afternoon contest. In round 19, they play on a Saturday night out there at Sydney Olympic Park. Technically, they are the away side this time round. They take on the South Sydney Rabbitohs. And then to close out section number 4 for 2023, they are the home side. They return to their spiritual home ground against the Brisbane Broncos, and that's a Saturday 3 p.m. game, and that's going to be pumping, and it's going to be a really tough test for the Brisbane Broncos. So looking at section 4, they do travel away from Accor Stadium only the once. And that's against Cronulla Sharks. But then they have a home game against Newcastle, a game against South Sydney. They have a bye, and then they have a home game, not at Sydney Olympic Park, but they host the Brisbane Broncos out at Belmore Sports Ground. Again, that's a much more simpler section for them to try and navigate. That trip to Shark Park is going to be very tricky, and the game against South Sydney is going to be difficult as well. But there's a couple of winnable games in there for the Canterbury-Bankstown Bulldogs. So if Bulldogs are in a position to make the top 8, their run to the finals looks like this. And it starts with a trip to the foot of the mountains. They take on the Penrith Panthers on a Sunday afternoon game. Yikes. Then they have a really difficult period here, a really difficult 4 weeks inside the final 7 or so rounds. So it starts with a home game up in Salter Oval, Bundaberg, up there in Queensland. So they travel to Queensland for just the second time this year to take on the Dolphins for the first time ever. Now, they are the home side, but that's still some travel. But then they have a bye. After that bye, they have back-to-back away games in Newcastle. That Newcastle game is a Sunday Channel 9 contest, and then they play another Sunday Channel 9 game against the Canberra Raiders. So that is a full month where they don't play a game at Accor Stadium or Belmore. The final 2 rounds, their first game is at Accor Stadium. They host the Manly Warringah Seagulls on a Sunday afternoon at 2 o'clock, and then they travel up to the Gold Coast to take on the Titans on a Sunday afternoon as well. So that's how their season rounds out, with a trip up to the Gold Coast. So their run to the finals, while the strength of opposition is very, very manageable for them, the traveling inside the middle portion of that really might hurt them, come back and bite them. So they've got the Panthers, Dolphins, Knights, Raiders, Manly, and the Gold Coast. And then there's a bye in there. They very well could go 4-2. They very easily could go 4-2, but just because they've come so far, or they could be coming from so far down the well after missing the final since 2016, that month where they're not playing a home game, oh man, that really worries me, bro. And then you've obviously got a game against the Penrith Panthers in there as well. And the Titans, who knows? But that run to the finals, it very well could be manageable. That's not the hardest way to end a season, but it's not the easiest either. Not too sure how I rank the Canterbury-Bankstown Bulldogs, because just really fresh reactions. Their strength of opposition, they take on the tougher teams in the first half of the season. And then they take on, you would say with all due respect, some nicer, easier teams to finish out the year. But they do a lot of traveling. There's consistent times where they're back-to-back away, and it's one trip to Melbourne and one trip to Sydney. Then they're away from home for an entire month. So the strength of opposition is good, but just the traveling and the way that it's been structured, is pretty difficult. So it's not the easiest, but it's not the toughest. I'd probably put the Bulldogs somewhere in the middle at the moment, probably leaning just a little bit over halfway at the moment. So what's your opinion if you're a Bulldogs fan? What's your opinion in general of the Bulldogs 2023 draw? We'll see you guys in the next episode, and thank you very much for the continuous support. Adios.